Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast. You're listening to an independent pod focused on geopolitical risk to serve risk professionals and decision makers across specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon, and I'm joined by Tom Johansmeyer, Global Head of Index Classes at broker price Forbes Re, based in Bermuda, where he focuses on alternative forms of risk transfer. Tom is also a PhD candidate at the University of Kent in Canterbury's School of Politics and International Relations, researching the role of insurance in cybersecurity strategy. Tom was previously the head of Property Claim Services, PCS, a division at data and analytics firm Verisk, providing data on industry-wide insured loss events for natural and man-made disaster events. In this role, he developed the first such tools for global cyber risk, which has since become his focus. Tom also says he proudly pushed paper for the US Army in the late 1990s, and if you were in the 2nd Infantry Division in 1998, you may have bugged Tom for your reassignment orders. In 2024, Tom has also written and co-written a number of papers and articles, all of which sit in the space between cyber, insurance, and the defence and security world, published in the RUSI Journal, the Irregular Warfare Initiative, Binding Hook, and War on the Rocks. We'll refer to them as we go. Without further ado, let's get into it. Tom, first of all, great to have you on the pod. Welcome.
Thanks, Dave. Good to talk to you.
So your focus has moved to the world of cyber insurance and cyber loss data, and you come at these issues from a background working in property catastrophe reinsurance data. So sticking with a kind of military vibe, how would you put your mission statement for cyber?
As a PhD candidate, I'm on a mission to civilize, quite frankly. The insurance and reinsurance industry so thoroughly misunderstands cyber catastrophe risk, and it's manifested in pricing, capital availability, risk transfer behavior. There are some really good things being done from a weak understanding, and that's what I'd like to see fixed. You know, you've got these fears of cyber mega catastrophe that are unjustified. You've got fears of cyber war that defy both empirical evidence and state incentive structures. Some of our fears as an industry make no sense. I think the easiest comparison that'll help folks understand the difference is the worst cyber attack on critical infrastructure in history is generally believed to be the 2015 Russian attack against the Ukrainian power grid. You've heard of this. This is the one everybody talks about. 230,000 people lost power for 1 to 6 hours. That's the worst of it. Hurricane Ida in Louisiana cost 1.1 million people access to power in the dead of summer, still hot, for more than a week. You had, I think, more than 30,000 individual repair points and the need to overcome access issues to get to those repair points for remediation. Data centers tend to be air conditioned, I have fond memories of, which is a lot easier, right? So when you think of cyber as a widespread impact field, theoretically at least, the remediation process is not. It's actually relatively concentrated on a systems basis where, you know, the remediation for CAT is truly geographically dispersed. What that means is that cyber is generally more reversible, and the academic literature goes on for days about this. Nat Cat is less reversible.
So anyone who's already seen the episode title will know that we're going to talk about cyber cat and how much of it is hyperbole. I think you're already getting into it, really, but you know, how does your analysis of cyber cat differ from the prevailing industry view of well, it's cyber war, it's systemic cyber cat?
Let's call it all cyber cat, right? War is a subset. Systemic is probably a subset as well, because you're thinking broader than what we would call a cat in the property world, which can be smaller hail events, right? So call it all cyber cat. I've heard some really crazy stuff where you've got, I know one firm is looking at like a $40 billion industry-wide insured loss as their kind of max worst of the worst. That's 10% of worldwide limit outstanding. That is unrealistic. If you take at face value the Swiss Re estimate that cyber insurance is 10% penetrated worldwide, which strikes me as a reasonable estimate, that would mean that $40 billion industry-wide insured loss would be 400 billion in terms of economic loss addressable. But if you add up the 10% market share, that means the addressable insurance market is 4 trillion relative to global GDP of around 120 trillion last I saw, which means that $400 billion economic loss to drive a $40 billion insured loss is really going to be several times that, because you're going to have economic losses that fall outside the addressable insurance market. You're looking at something north of $1.5 trillion in economic loss to drive that $40 billion insured loss. I mean, I did some research, which I think you've seen, to build out a history of cyber cat losses going on an economic basis, going back to 1998. Adjust that for inflation at 3%, you're looking at $300 billion. So we're going to see a single event 5 times 25 years of cyber cat losses. No, we got to get real.
Well, before we go any further, let's talk about the elephant in the room, because there was a major cyber outage just a few weeks ago, CrowdStrike. Now, does that count as a cyber cat of sorts or a systemic cyber event of sorts? I know that obviously, depending who you are in the industry, firms will be looking to drive on the reinsurance side things like increased demand for excess of loss covers that hasn't been there for cyber previously. So it really depends where you sit in the industry.
So yes, it's a cat, because you know the drill. It's only a cat when PCS says it is. And PCS has designated this a global PCS global cyber catastrophe, which means it's likely to exceed $250 million in industry-wide insured loss. So is it a cat? Yes. Is it carnage? No. The range of insured estimates being put out is 300 mil to 1.5 billion industry-wide insured. My back of the napkin on this puts it at probably, I'm calling it 300 to 500. I can see 500 is realistic. I can see some bounces taking it down to 250, 300. And I think on the worst of all worst possible days, it could approach $1 billion, but that's it. And I saw Science put out an economic loss range of 1 to 3 billion with a best estimate of 1.7. And I'm here for it. I think that makes sense. So let's talk about context, though, for these numbers. What's interesting is calling CrowdStrike 500 million insured makes it roughly similar to my back of the napkin for Change Healthcare and Move It, both of which I'd say are in the $500 to $700 million industry-wide insured range. There's less data on the CDK loss, but I think it's in there as well. So this CrowdStrike loss, this massive event everybody is saying, is roughly the same as 3 others which have occurred in the past year or so. What we're looking at is really probably $2 to $2.5 billion of aggregate industry-wide insured cyber cat loss. So if CrowdStrike's a big deal, it's really 4 times a big deal, because there are a bunch of other events just like it, and nobody's broken a sweat. The visuals make the difference, right? You see people waiting in airports, not knowing where their next flight is. We've all been there. It's terrible. We've all got, those experiences that we can look back on, but it's done, right? The economic loss really wasn't that bad, because being stuck in an airport is not economic damage.
Yeah.
There are workarounds. There are deferred value rather than lost value. It's just not that big. And when you take the economic loss, that makes sense, A, because the cost of people waiting for a flight's really not that bad. And it's been called the biggest accumulation event since NotPetya, which is technically true for 2 reasons. A, there hasn't really been anything that big since. You could make an argument that if it's 1.7 billion, Change Healthcare might be marginally bigger on an economic loss basis. I kind of peg that at 2 to 2.5. The other part of the technicality, though, is WannaCry came before NotPetya, and WannaCry at 4 billion economic at the time would be bigger than this as well. Mm-hmm. But because it came a month and a half before, okay, we get the technicality to support it. This is an event that looks bad, and then it's driven by all the what if nonsense. What if it were a state actor? What if it was worse than it was? Oh, it wasn't. What if it wasn't as bad as it was, right? My personal rule is if you're going to what if bad, you got to what if not as bad as well, because they're equally valid.
Well, let's talk about a recent paper that you co-authored on Ukraine. So obviously, if CrowdStrike is a recent single event that's very relevant, then you could say the Ukraine conflict is a sort of petri dish for cyber within a hot war in Europe. So the paper you co-authored with Gareth Mott and Jason Nurse explored this. It's called Cyber Strategy and Practice, the Evolution of US, Russian and Ukrainian National Cybersecurity Strategies to the Experience of War. So you said in that paper, or you and your co-author said, that Russian strategy for cyber had only limited effectiveness. For our purposes, obviously, because most of our listeners are in the insurance market and in the West, it's probably best if we focus on that group of potential targets. So is there any evidence that Russia's enjoying more success against Ukraine's friends in the West? Things like information warfare, disinformation, disruption, denial of service attacks.
Interesting that you bring up disinformation, right? When you look at the Russian view of cybersecurity strategy, it's a lot bigger than what we would call cyber, right? If you're thinking hacking, if you're thinking denial of service, which is a blunt instrument and not terribly effective, if you're thinking ransomware and other compromise of systems, that's a much smaller priority than information operations. Information operations is where, the GRU lives and breathes, and where they're arguably more effective because you're shaping sentiment over a long period of time. And, folks like to move to Brexit or the US election when it comes to disinformation. But the reality is it's a global South discussion.
What would you say are some of the lessons for US cyber strategy, but also for private sector organizations, the type that matters to the insurance market?
What's interesting is in US cybersecurity strategy, we're seeing a convergence of the public and private sector. So if you read the March 2023 US National Cybersecurity Strategy, what's interesting is the notion of deputization of the private sector. The strategy is pretty clearly telling the tech sector, A, you're the first line of defense, and B, our job's not to protect you. Your job is to protect us. The NCSS goes pretty clearly to state that government will focus on matters of government. Diplomacy, security, espionage, embassy operations, the drill. When it comes to actual cyber stuff, they're saying they expect the tech sector to pick that up, and even hinted at the notion of strict liability with regard to cybersecurity and those products. Now, it's not legislation, it's not an executive order, so it's not something you have to worry about yet. But the notion that tech companies could lose their ability to transfer liability to their customers is kind of a warning shot in a document like that. And what's really interesting is a lot of my sources in the insurance and reinsurance sector did note control over liability in license agreements is part of what kept the industry loss contained for the CrowdStrike event.
So in June, you wrote another article, this time for the Irregular Warfare Initiative, Cyber Attacks in Perspective, Cutting Through the Hyperbole. And that is, I guess, the same basic theme as what we're talking about today. Why do you think the insurance sector is so afraid of CyberCat?
Habit by now. So you had an industry that moved into cyber early on and worried about a lot that we didn't understand. So you go back to 2012, 13, 14. Interestingly, cyber was seen as a potential massive D&O style risk. All anybody could talk about was the massive cyber losses that would follow from a reputational incident. Turns out reputational hasn't been a big deal in cyber. When you look at, loss of share price following a cyber attack, there have been a handful of relevant examples, not many, and most of them niche. CrowdStrike, SolarWinds, Equifax came back pretty fast, to be honest. And the only remaining big one behind that would be Heartland Payment Systems, which is 15 years ago. So we were worried about reputation. We were worried about the unknown. We didn't have much data or history to work with. Okay, fine. What's tough, though, is we never seemed to advance our thinking. Folks have been able to say, well, I'm afraid of things like cyber war. I'm going to be really conservative because nobody can fault me for that. So I'm just going to dig in. And I swear the last honest man was one of my research subjects for my doctoral thesis research who said, look, I'm afraid of major cyber events because I watch too many movies. You know, it was refreshing. I mean,
I think the way it's reported has something to play in this. We've already talked about NotPetya to some extent, which was back in 2017. And you wrote another article on this, specifically NotPetya, debunking NotPetya's cyber cat myth in Binding Hook online. So it's been described as, like a cyber Pearl Harbor. Is NotPetya the biggest example of hyperbole?
the biggest example of hyperbole I can get on board with. Yeah. It's funny. Most people call it the biggest cyber cat, the biggest economic loss from cyber cat in history, because that's what the US put out. But I think what people misunderstand is like it came out in 2017 from an administration prone to hyperbole. These are the biggest crowd sizes we've ever seen. This is the biggest, So yeah, this is the biggest cyber cat we've ever seen. There's been nothing as big as this before. When you dial back that, outer borough New York bravado, okay, it was a big deal, but not, the end of the world. As far as economic loss goes, it was actually below average since 1998. And what I find interesting is that it was probably the most sophisticated of such attacks, but below average in economic loss, which means attacks are having to do more and more to accomplish less and less, because we've done things like institutionalized security and a culture of security over the past 25 years. The biggest events were in 2003 and 4, where adjusted for inflation at 3%, pick a number you like, right? 60 to 70 billion dollars per, the two biggest. In 2004, we weren't really paying our credit card bills online yet. We didn't have this massive online culture. And to that point, security hadn't really been institutionalized yet either. Yeah, I remember the Melissa and the I Love You viruses. I worked for a .com company in 2000. And when one of the worms hit, people were yelling over the cubicle walls, "Don't open that. It wasn't really from me. Just delete it. Just delete it." So it's important to keep that in mind, because we didn't have the filters and tools that we do today. So it's easier to get to 40, 50, 60 billion dollars 20 years ago, where today it's pretty hard to get to 10.
Which leads me to another article from April 2024. So why natural catastrophes will always be worse than cyber catastrophes. So you wrote that for War on the Rocks, and going into the long-term data. So you already name-checked events going back 20 years ago. Yeah, so 21 cyber cat events since 1998. What did you find by looking at the long-term data that we have available?
It's not a big deal, and it's getting better. I mean, you add this stuff up, and 25 years of cyber cat economic losses are marginally more expensive than the economic loss from the 2011 Tohoku cat. So a quarter century of cyber cat is about the same as the worst economic loss for that period in Nat cat terms. Nat cat losses for that period were about 14 times the size of cyber cat losses. I remember doing my research for that data set. I was digging through, the bowels of the cyber cat commentary on the internet from from 20 years ago. And I saw an old school flame war between a bunch of bloggers over some of these economic losses. And there was a firm, MI2G, at the time that was putting out a lot of this information. And there was some guy for the Register, for example, was talking about the awful and alarmist and unnecessarily high estimates for some of these events, like So Big, like My Doom, and how it was, just awful alarmism designed to scare people.
Well, let's look at those two events. So Big 2003, My Doom 2004. I think for all we're talking about a topic that is hyped and subject to a lot of hyperbole, those two events are largely forgotten. So how big were they, and what do they teach us?
At the time, My Doom was 38. At the time, So Big was 35. So we're talking mid 60s now at 3%. And a friend of mine in the industry was like, should I be embarrassed that I don't know these as a cyber underwriting executive? I was like, you should, up until you realize that nobody does. So, they were forgotten. Were they as big as the reported data suggests? My conclusion is it doesn't matter because they're so small and they were forgotten. Economically, they were easy to absorb. And if you were to see them today, you can't really say that because they wouldn't happen today. But could we absorb a $30-40 billion economic loss from cyber today? Yeah. I mean, we absorbed a $100 billion economic loss from Hurricane Ian. So $40 billion worth of cyber economic distributed around the world. We can handle that. That's the lesson. I guess you could try to stretch it, but I would even say, like, look, if you think the mid-30s billion estimates for those at the time was high and alarmist, then all you can do is take a non-impact and estimate it to be less. If these numbers are a rounding error on economic losses from major event like NatCat for the past 25 years that were alarmist for their size, really means that, okay, we should just care about them less and less. I think what was missing at the time was contextualizing those losses compared to something like NatCat, which, okay, it was early in the days of the internet. There were few kind of intuitive overlaps to things like NatCat, which we have today, right? The insurance industry's interest and participation in cyber has helped make those comparisons happen, which aids this contextualization overall, which I think is crucial. But if you were to say in 2004, $38 billion for a worldwide cyber cat economic loss is alarmist. Well, I mean, that was the year we had Charlie, Yvonne, Francis, and whatever the fourth one was, the 2004 Florida hurricanes. You had $38 billion in 04, $35 billion in 03 for two cats, right? Those 2 years together are probably about $200 billion in economic loss. And the following year, you had KRW, Katrina, Rita, and Wilma. You put those three storms together, the economic loss just absolutely dwarfs the entirety of CyberCat economic losses for 03 and 04, and all economic losses to that point.
Now let's discuss the Lloyd's systemic risk scenario for cyber back from October 2023. You've taken this one to task previously. It certainly sits at the top end of the numbers put out by the sector, headlined by a $3.5 trillion economic loss.
Granted, they say it comes over 5 years. If you divide that evenly at 700 million per year, am I right? No, it's 700 billion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's more than twice all CyberCat economic losses for the past 25, now 26 years. You have for each year for 5 years. Now, it's unrealistic. If worldwide cyber crime losses are the $1 trillion per year that we see advertised from time to time, you're talking about incrementing that by 70% for 5 years in a row. Now, distributing that evenly, that $3.5 trillion evenly over 5 years is itself a gift because we know the bulk of it would come up front and then it would trail, right? So what's the first year? $2.5 trillion? If it's $3.5 trillion over 5, it's not going to be less than 2 in year one. I don't know how you get there. It's just not in or of the real world. Reversibility is such a powerful counterbalancing factor to the size and scale and quote unquote potential for damage. Stuff doesn't stay down long. You hear, what if it's down for a week? Oh, come on, man. We're seeing in Ukraine in 2015, the grid came back in 6 hours. If you want to do damage, you don't do cyber. And that's one of the other lessons from the conflict in Ukraine. The power outages from cyber have been minimal. And what's really, take the TV tower, there's talk of, communications trying to be hacked in Ukraine, and it didn't work. An $830,000 cruise missile did the job. Bits and bytes don't do damage, bullets and bombs do.
Now, insurance is an industry that thrives on risk data. Is there an issue wherein all of this hyperbole in cyber cat risk perception comes from a lack of data for the modeling?
There's not a lack of data. I mean, the problem is we're ignoring the data. We're trying to criticize the data. The data set I've pulled together, I've had a lot of insurance people say, well, I don't buy it. Well, good. Formulate an argument as to why you don't buy it. There's too much of this, I don't buy it, or cyber war is a big deal without any supporting evidence. This has got to stop. We do such a good job in NatCat. And for cyber to say, oh, we're different, A, not really, B, prove it. There is a lot of information available. The cyber insurance industry's perception or understanding of cyber war traces back almost directly to a 1993 paper by two RAND analysts, Arkila and Ronfelt, where they talk about the imminence and potential severity of cyber war. Now, if nothing had happened since 1993, that might be valid. Since then, I joined and completed my military tour, and other things have happened during that 30-year interlude as well, to include the publication by Thomas Rid in 2012 of his famous piece, The Cyber War Will Not Take Place. The notion of cyber war in the 1993 sense has largely been debunked, dismantled, and dismissed. The cyber Pearl Harbor is not the legitimate fear it was back in 1993. Cyber Pearl Harbor is not what we need to worry about. We need to worry about economic security. We need to worry about espionage. But the notion of somebody dismantling the infrastructure of the free world via cyber attack is not the major threat. So we need to start integrating, I would say, these new perspectives, but they're new perspectives that are a decade old. Insurers need to spend more time talking to the security and policy community. I've heard a lot of folks say, well, you know what? I've sat with cyber cat modelers for weeks to understand. It's like, no, man, that's not what you got to do. Go down to Millbank, get inside the Beltway, talk to the heavy hitters who look at issues like cyber war and cyber conflict, because they got something to say and you should probably hear it.
Let's talk about the reinsurance market, because following on from that point about the huge size of that Lloyd's estimate, there's definite reluctance among some of the major reinsurers to take on much cyber cat risk in the same way as they have it, the nat cat exposure. And that's surely to some extent because of this, in your opinion, unjustified fear. But that's not a good place to be in, right? We need reinsurers to be willing to step in.
Yeah, we need to get it right rather than be conservative enough to be safe. Now, in my research, I found that a lot of cyber insurers actually want access to non-proportional reinsurance cover. They want cyber cat cover. They want more ASL. They want to keep more of their attritional book, which they believe they've begun to really understand and want to keep more of the profit they've been shipping out.
I think that's certainly something that's starting to happen from what I read and what I hear. But it has been proportional cover mainly over the years, but starting to maybe buy XOL, excess of loss reinsurance for cyber.
The spirit has been more willing than the capacity has been available. So you're correct. This has not largely been a quota share play. That's what 90% of the market trades for reinsurance. And for years, that suited everybody. Insurers could say, hey, you know what? I get access to more underwriting capacity. I manage my ags, all well and good. The reinsurers can go in and say, hey, you know what? We can get access to the whole market. We can see the data. We get, generally improving attritional book, and we can manage our own kind of investment in this space. Okay, cool. Over the past couple of years, insurers have been saying, you know what? We now have a handle on this. We want to keep the attritional and hedge out the cat, which is the classic role of the reinsurance industry, right? You look at property cat, the reinsurers take on the volatility. Now it's time to do that for cyber cat as well. The difficulty is that cyber reinsurers have been reluctant to change. Hey, why sacrifice access to that profitable attritional book? Why spend money to make the investment to be able to model and transact in non-proportional when you don't have to, right? So there are market pressures that are finally changing that. I was talking to somebody recently who was saying that their net on their quota shares after losses, after acquisition expenses, after outwards is probably, call it 13 to 17% would be an indicative range for quota share only cyber reinsurer. You can get that in the non-proportional market and for much less exposure, right? And increasing acquisition costs are making non-proportional reinsurance increasingly attractive. I think you're going to see more of the smaller and mid-range cyber reinsurers go in that direction. I think it's going to be slower going on the large end, but overall, the market will head there. And that is the most important piece in growing the cyber insurance market. It's not ILS, it's not cat bonds, it's not adding more capacity. It's literally something as simple as moving everybody back into the positions they should be playing, right? Insurers should be writing insurance, holding their attritional, and seeding out their cat. Reinsurers should be taking on the cat, just like they do in Florida. And the retro and ILS market should be doing those truly remote kind of solvency or rating agency type trades.
Yeah, I didn't want to let the ILS markets off the hook. How are they pricing CyberCat? How wrongly are they pricing it? By how much?
It's hard to say the ILS guys are mispricing it because they're being offered really rich rates. So I wouldn't say they're doing anything wrong. If you were to give me some of these high rates relative to the real expected loss,
I'm sure they'll take it. We all would. Yeah,
absolutely. So for me, the real question is how much is being overpaid for this protection? And at what point is it not worth it to the ILS market to stay in? So when you look at the prices that were transacted at for cyber bonds in Q4 last year, for example, two things happened. A, most of the ILS managers that participated took smaller pieces. There weren't many big commitments. There were a few, but most of the market's watching. And a lot of the activity is tied up in the hands of a few players. And the other is, and I heard this from a lot of especially the smaller guys, like, hey, at those rates, I couldn't say no. Of course I would do it. And the question is, how much lower can you go and have it still be a no-brainer? And when it's no longer a no-brainer, are you willing to invest in real hardcore analysis and investment decision-making? I think that's a wide open question right now. I know a few of the smaller guys were saying, you know what, as long as it's a no-brainer we're in, we're not really ready to invest in this class seriously. Now, I do believe there's enough volume from those many smaller players that does become a strategic problem if they exit. So I think Q4 2023 was an interesting proof of concept year, but I don't see it as a runaway story quite yet. I know that even some of the beefier players in the cyber ILS space are remaining cautious. The other notion is among kind of potential sponsors, there's this notion that, well, you know what, the ILS market has to step in and help us grow. No, they don't. One of the biggest barriers I found in my research to the adoption of cyber ILS is nat cat losses since 2017. And investors want to see progress in the core nat cat business before they're going to entertain new ideas. And that is potentially a bigger impediment to the growth of cyber ILS than anything to do with cyber expected losses or other kind of cyber market dynamics.
Let's round off with a kind of productive or constructive point about what the industry should be doing differently or better or less of or more of in this space to get a better, more realistic grip of CyberCat.
Easiest thing you can do right now is start to really collaborate better with the modelers. You know what? Everybody loves to blame the modelers, but without access to good data, it's going to persist as a difficulty. If insurers start collaborating with the modelers a little bit better, a little bit more fully, the modelers can do a better job and we'll see risk transfer advance more easily. Part two of that is get the hyperbole and exaggeration under control. The problem is the modelers can do a good job, but take a look at the estimates for CrowdStrike. Do I think that the folks who are saying it's 300 to a billion or 500 to 1.5 billion really mean the upper end? I'm skeptical, man. I read 300 to a billion as 300 to 500, but oh yeah, we got to throw a billion in there just to make sure nobody thinks we're undercooking this. Yeah, I look at 500 to 1.5 and think it's 500 to a billion, but we can't say 1 billion without risking our credibility.
Just to echo your point earlier, not just talk to the modelers, but talk to people outside of the insurance world too.
Absolutely. Through my research and some of the publishing I've done, the people I've met in the cybersecurity and policy and defense community, man, they are just so exceptionally interesting and plugged in, and they have a lot to say, and they want to learn more about insurance. So there's a really easy collaborative opportunity here. And all it takes is getting on the phone with some of these really interesting folks. It's worth it. I can guarantee you that. I found it to be just so helpful.
Well, that's about all for this episode. After the relative hiatus of August, we'll be back in September with not 1, not 2, but 3 episodes, including the first in a new series of specials from a new sponsor, Gallagher Specialty, who I'm proud and privileged to work with. Until the next time, I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guest, Tom Johansmeyer. Thanks for listening. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.